There's a kind of hunger that doesn't live in the stomach. I've seen men starve. I've seen them chew boot leather in a bad February and come out the other side of it laughing. That hunger is loud. It screams at you. It's honest. But there's another kind, the quiet kind. It sits behind a girl's ribs and it doesn't ask for bread at all. It asks for a reason. It asks to be allowed to build something. And a person carrying that hunger will walk barefoot through frost, take a beating in the street and stand up again over a basket of eggs. I watched it happen. October of '84, in a town too small to deserve a name and too mean to have earned one. I watched a 16-year-old girl stand in the mud with 14 eggs and no one on her side, and I watched the whole town decide what she was worth. I'm going to tell you what she did. I'm going to tell you what the mountain man did. And I'm going to tell you what I did, which is the part I've never told anybody in 41 years, and the reason I keep a ledger to this day with one line in it that will never balance. Stay with me. This one costs something to hear. The first egg broke at 7:40 in the morning, and I know that because I had my watch out. And I know I had my watch out because I am a coward, and a coward always finds something to look at. It made a sound. That's what nobody tells you. A raw egg hitting hard-packed mud doesn't splash. It taps, soft and stupid and small, like a knuckle on a door nobody's going to answer. The yolk sat there whole for a second in its ruin of white. Perfect. Round as a coin. Then Otpreen's boot heel came down on it and it wasn't anything at all. 13, said the girl. Not loud. Not to him. She said it the way you'd say it to yourself if you were counting nails or counting cattle or counting the days until something you were waiting for. She had the basket clutched against her stomach with both arms wrapped around it, hunched over it like a woman shielding a lamp from wind, and she had her chin down and her eyes up, and she said 13 with a flatness that made the back of my neck go cold. Preen heard it. That was the trouble. Preen heard everything a person said and none of what they meant, which is the exact recipe for a man who ends up wearing a tin star in a town with 60 souls in it. You countin' at me, girl? She didn't answer. He reached into the basket. She turned her body away, a small movement, a hip and a shoulder, the way a cat turns from a hand, and he got hold of another one anyway and held it up over his head where everyone could see it, and the sun came through the shell and made it glow, a little brown gold lamp in a big dirty fist. This here, Preen announced, to the 11 or 12 of us who'd stopped, come out of Rose Kessler's henhouse, and this Injun brat has been robbin' her blind since haying. He opened his fingers. Tap. 12, said the girl. My name is Amos Deal, and at that time I was 51 years old. I ran the livery on the north end of the street. My left hip had been ruined by a horse in '72 and never set right, and I kept a ledger. I want to be plain about the ledger, because people have laughed at me for it and I have never much minded, and because you cannot understand a single thing that happened that autumn if you don't understand the ledger first. It was a green cloth-bound thing, the size of a family Bible, and I had it from a bankrupt dry goods man in Trinidad for 4 bits. In it I wrote what was owed to me and what I owed. That's all. Not money, particularly. Money was a small part of it. If a man borrowed my sorrel for a day and brought her back curried, I wrote it. If a woman brought me a pie because I'd fixed her gate, I wrote it. And I did not consider that gate paid for until I'd fixed something else, because a pie is worth more than a gate, and I don't like being ahead. When my wife died in '79, I wrote her name, and I wrote 19 years, and I left the other column blank, and I have never known what to put in it. Men laughed. Fine. The world runs on people who think a debt is a feeling and not a fact, and it runs badly. And I decided a long time back that I would rather be a fool with a clean column than a comfortable man who couldn't remember what he'd been given. I mention it now because on the morning of the eggs, my ledger contained 22 entries under the name Ynez Tallow, and every one of them was in the paid column, and not one living person in that town knew it but me. She was 16. Her mother was Chiricahua, taken young to the reservation, and then taken again by a Missouri man named Ynez Tallow who called it marriage and who was, in my considered opinion after 11 years of knowing him, the emptiest human being I ever shook hands with. Her mother died of the coughing sickness when the girl was 9. That left Ynez with her father's name, her mother's face, and her father's house, which is to say a soddy with a rotten ridgepole out past the Kessler place where the good grass gives up. The town called her Nessie when it was feeling kind, and it called her other things when it wasn't. She had a gray wool coat 3 sizes too large that had belonged to a dead freighter, and she went barefoot from May to hard frost, not from poverty exactly, though the poverty was real, but because she had 1 pair of boots and she was saving them. Saving boots. 16 years old. She came to my livery on the first Tuesday of every month with a jar. That's what the 22 entries were. Every month 1 jar of wild honey she cut out of a bee tree up on the north slope, hands stung to sausage, and she would set it on my counter and say, "Eggs," and I would say, "How many?" and she'd say a number, and I would go with her over to Rose Kessler's and I would buy the eggs because Rose Kessler would not sell to her. Would not sell to her. Rose was a widow, 60-odd, and she was not cruel in any large way. She was cruel the way a stone in your boot is cruel, without any malice at all in it. She would look right through that girl to the fence behind and say, "I don't believe I have any today, Amos," while 40 hens made an unholy racket 8 feet behind her, and then she would sell me a dozen for a dime and go back inside. So I bought them, and I handed them over the fence rail, and back in the ledger it went. Why Tallow 1 jar honey received. 1 daz eggs rendered square. Square. That's the word I used. 22 times I wrote that word, and 22 times I knew I was lying, because there's nothing square about a transaction where one party pays with 3 days of stinging labor and blood in her hair from where the bees got up under her scarf, and the other party pays with a dime and the accident of a white face. I never said any of that out loud, of course. I want to be clear on that too. I have never once been the man who says the thing out loud. She never told me what the eggs were for. 11 months I bought them, and 11 months I handed them across a fence, and 11 months I did not ask, because I have a theory that if you ask a proud person a question they'll have to lie to, you've stolen something off them. But I knew, or I'd worked most of it out, the way a man works out a leak by the stain on the ceiling. Because she wasn't eating them. You can tell. A body that's had eggs looks different from a body that hasn't, and hers had that gray about the mouth all winter, and one time in March I saw her come out of Halbert's store with a paper of salt and nothing else, counting her change twice like the coins might have bred. So the eggs went somewhere. And there was a bantam rooster living in the wreck of the chicken run behind the tallow soddy, a mean little copper-colored thing that shouldn't have survived 1 winter let alone 4, and I'd seen a nail keg out there with straw in it. She was setting them. That's what I finally worked out sometime around the 2nd summer. She wasn't buying eggs. She was buying hens. She was buying the daughters of hens. She was buying 1 dime and 1 bee sting at a time, a flock, and behind the flock, if you followed the arithmetic out far enough, a thing you could sell from. A thing that made more of itself while you slept. The only kind of wealth a person with nothing has ever been able to build from nothing, going back to Egypt. And she'd figured it out at 14 with no schooling and a rotten ridgepole, and had been working the plan for 2 years like a general. Most of them died. That's the thing I couldn't get past. Foxes got them, and the cold got them, and 1 whole clutch drowned in a spring flood, and every single time she came back on the first Tuesday with a jar and said eggs, and named a number, and never once said anything about the ones she'd lost. I have known men with everything to lose quit for less. I have known men quit before they started. On the grounds that starting is undignified, I've been one. So October and Aunt Preen with his boot, and a girl saying 12. Here's what had happened, as near as I ever pieced it together. Rose Kessler had been losing eggs. Real losses. You can't fake an empty nest box. And somebody had told her, or she'd told herself, and by the time it got to Preen it had the shape of a fact. And the girl had been up before light that morning, and she'd walked 6 miles into town on frost with her boots on, which is what wrecks me even now, because that meant she judged it an occasion. She'd put her boots on, and she'd had 14 eggs in a basket lined with her own scarf, and she was carrying them the way you carry an infant, and she'd been 11 steps from my door. Because she was bringing them to me. Not from Kessler's, from hers, her hens. Her 4 surviving hens out of 2 years of dimes and stings, and it was the first surplus that girl had produced in her entire life, and she was walking it into town to trade it for the winter's flour. Preen took the basket off her at the corner of the street, and instead of running or crying or explaining, she followed him back into the middle of the road and took hold of the basket with both arms and would not let go, and 13 townspeople came out to watch, and I came out too, and I stood on my own step with my watch in my hand. "Where'd you get 'em?" Preen said. "They're mine." "You got hens?" "4." "She's got 4 hens," Preen said over his shoulder, and got the laugh he wanted, because a laugh is the cheapest thing there is, and everybody had a little to spare that morning. 4 hens laying 14 eggs, that's some hens. 3 days, she said. "What?" 3 days of laying. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she stopped and started again and got it level. "I saved them, 3 days." And it was so obviously, so plainly, so arithmetically true. 4 hens, 3 days, 14 eggs. A child could do it. And I watched it land on Preen's face, and I watched it not stick. And I understood something about the world right then that I had spent 51 years politely declining to understand. He wasn't confused. He'd heard her. He simply had decided in advance what she was, and no fact was going to be permitted to argue with it. He reached in for the 3rd egg. "Now, I've told this part in a saloon exactly once, and a man asked me why I didn't step down off my step, and I hit him, and he was right and I was wrong, and I paid for the chair. The truth is I was 3 seconds from it. I want that on record, even though a record of a thing you nearly did is worth exactly nothing. I had my hand on the post. I had the sentence in my mouth. She's got the hens, I've seen 'em. I've been buying her the setting eggs for 2 years. And I could feel exactly how the town would receive that sentence. The little turn of the heads, Amos has been buying eggs for the Injun girl. And what it would do to my custom, and what it would do to the thing I had instead of a life, which was being the man everybody liked well enough not to think about. 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds the mountain came down into the street. You could smell him before you turned around. That was the first thing. Not filth, exactly, beaver castor and juniper smoke and old grease, and something underneath it like wet stone. He'd come in on foot with a mule behind him, and I hadn't heard the mule, which tells you something about how the whole street was leaning in toward that basket. Cull Barrow. He came down twice a year, spring and fall, to sell hides and buy powder and coffee and go back up, and in 11 years I don't believe I'd heard him string 6 words together. He was maybe 60, maybe 45. There was no telling. The beard had gone the color of dirty snow, and his hands looked like something you'd find in a riverbed. There was a story that he'd had a family once in Missouri. There was another story that he'd killed a man in Bent's Fort. Neither story ever came with a source, and I suspect the town made them both up, because a town cannot abide a man who doesn't need it, and it will invent reasons for him. He walked past me. He walked past Rose Kessler and past the Halberts and past 2 of the Dunphy boys, and he stopped about 4 feet behind Preen, and he waited. Preen turned around with the egg in his hand. And for a long moment there was no sound in that street but 40 hens somewhere behind a fence, and the mule shifting, and my own watch, which I could hear ticking, which I have never been able to explain because a watch is not that loud. "Barrow," Preen said. Barrow looked at the egg. "Man's business," Preen said. His voice had gone up a little thin at the edges. Town business. Barrow looked at the girl, then at the basket. Then slowly, the way water finds a way downhill, he came around Preen's shoulder, not fast, not touching him, just around, the way weather comes around a hill, and he crouched down in the mud in front of Ynez Tallow, and he was still taller than she was. He put out one of those riverbed hands, palm up. She didn't move. I have thought about that moment more than I have thought about my own wedding, God forgive me, because he was asking for the basket. That's what the hand meant. And every soul in that street, myself included, read it as a man taking a thing off a child, and the girl read it that way too, and I watched her arms tighten and I watched her get ready to lose the last of it. And then she looked at his face. I couldn't see what was in it. I was behind him. I have never known and I never will. She put the basket in his hands. He stood up with it. He turned around. He walked back to the mule and he unlashed a bundle off the pack saddle, and he came back and he dropped it in the mud at Aunt Preen's feet, and it fell open, and it was beaver. Prime fall beaver, 8 or 9 pelts, deep and dark and heavy with oil, worth. I ran the livery. I knew what things were worth better than $60 in Trinidad, and there wasn't a man in that town who'd see $60 before the spring. For the eggs, Barrow said. It was the first time I ever heard his voice. It sounded like a door in a barn. Preen stared at the pelts, and I saw it go across his face, the same thing I'd seen when she said 3 days, the fact arriving, and the fact being turned away at the door. That ain't the point, Preen said, and he was almost pleading, which I've never forgotten. The point is she took him. She didn't, Barrow said. You don't know that. No, Barrow set the basket down careful on a dry patch by the trough. Then he straightened up. You don't neither. I'd like to tell you that ended it. What ended it was Rose Kessler, and it did not end it well, and I am going to have to tell this part slowly because I have never gotten it right when I've told it fast. She came down off her porch, 60-odd years old, apron on, hands wet from something. And she stood there and she looked at the eggs and she looked at the girl, and something moved behind that gray face that in a better woman would have become shame. I want to see the hens, she said. And Ynez said no. Just that, no. The whole street went strange, because Rose Kessler had in her own mind just offered mercy, show me and I'll believe you, and it had been refused by a barefoot girl in a dead man's coat, and nobody could make sense of it. Preen laughed like he'd won. Somebody said there it is. Even Barrow turned his head. And I knew why. God help me, I was the only person on that street who knew why, and I stood there and let the silence run. The hens were in the soddy, inside. In the house, in a nail keg by the stove, because it was October and the run wasn't fox-proof, and she'd already lost 3 clutches. And the only way she'd kept 4 birds alive to lay those 14 eggs was to bring them in and live with them and sleep in the smell of them. And Ynez Tallow was in that house. Her father hadn't drawn a sober breath since August. He was on his back on a corn-shuck mattress with a jug and the ridgepole rotting over him, and he had, in July, sold the stove lids for whiskey, and in September he had tried to sell the hens. She'd hidden them from her own father. That was the arrangement of her life. That was the great engineering project of Ynez Tallow's 16 years, 4 birds, a nail keg, and a man she could not leave and could not trust, all inside one room with a bad roof. And Rose Kessler said, show me the hens. And what she was actually saying, without the first notion of it, was, let me walk into your house and see the worst thing about your father and the smallest thing about your life, and then I will decide in front of everyone whether you are a thief. No, of course no. Ynez stood there with her jaw set and let them think it, and she looked at the mud. And I watched a 16-year-old girl choose her father's dignity over her own name, in front of 13 people who would never in their lives extend her the same courtesy. And I did not say one word. 22 entries, square. They ran her out. It wasn't dramatic. That's what I need you to understand. Nothing about it was dramatic. There was no rope, no mob. Preen said she wasn't welcome to trade in town, and Halbert said he wasn't going to sell to her account anymore, and Rose Kessler went back inside and shut her door, and one of the Dunphy boys, who was 11, threw a clod of mud that missed. And that was all. 6 or 7 sentences, spoken at a reasonable volume on a Tuesday morning, and a girl's future was over. She stood there a while after they'd stopped. I think she was waiting to see if it was really finished. Then she went to the trough and picked up her basket and looked in it. 12 eggs. She counted them. Out loud, with her lips moving, 12, and she took the scarf out and shook the mud off it and folded it and put it back under them. And her hands were shaking so hard she had to stop halfway and press them flat against her thighs. And that was the only moment, that one, the flat hands, 6 seconds, that anything in her face broke. Then she picked up the basket and walked out of town, north, toward the bad grass. Boots on. She never asked for the pelts back. She never looked at Barrow at all. Cull Barrow stood in the road for a good while after. Then he gathered up his beaver out of the mud, one at a time, without hurry, and he lashed them onto the mule, and he did not go into the store, and he did not buy his powder or his coffee, and he walked out of town north, 20 minutes behind her, and everybody watched him go, and nobody said anything about it. I went inside. I opened the ledger on the counter, and I sat with the pen in my hand, and I could not for the life of me figure out what to write. Because here's where the arithmetic breaks. She'd never owed me. I'd bought the eggs. She'd paid me in honey worth 3 times what the eggs cost, so there was no entry to make under her name. My hands were clean. The column balanced. That is what I told myself with the pen dry in my fingers for something close to an hour while it got dark outside, and then I turned back through the pages, and I found the entry from March of '82. Why tallow 1 jar honey wrecked, 1 doz eggs rendered square. And underneath, in my own hand in pencil, a note I'd made and forgotten. Hands bad, stings up both arms, didn't say. I sat there with that. Didn't say. And I understood, finally, what I'd been doing for 2 years with my dimes and my discretion, and my careful, courteous, cowardly refusal to ask her a single question. I'd been keeping the account private. I'd made sure that not one person in that town ever learned that Ynez Tallow had bought every egg she owned. I'd protected her pride, which was a lovely thing to tell myself, and what I had actually protected was my own standing, and the cost of it came due at 7:40 that morning in the middle of the street, and she paid it. I could have said 1 sentence. I sold her those birds' mothers 2 years running. 11 words, I'd counted them. I'd had them in my mouth. And I have wondered ever since whether the reason I keep a ledger at all is that some part of me has always known I would need a place to write down the things I didn't do. I picked up the pen and I wrote. Oct 14, 1884. Why tallow owed everything, rendered nothing. And then I sat there and I looked at the word nothing until the lamp got low. And then I got up and put on my coat and went out to the livery and saddled the sorrel in the dark, which with my hip took me the better part of half an hour, and I rode north. I want to be honest even here at the end of it. I didn't ride out of courage. I rode because a man can lie to a town, but he can't lie to a book. The Soddy was 6 miles out, and I came on it about 10 at night with a hard frost coming down and a moon like a chip of bone. There was no light in the window. There was no door in the door. It was off its hinges and standing against the wall, and the roof at the north end had come down, not fallen, come down, in the way a roof does when the ridgepole finally gives, and the whole place stood open to the sky with frost already forming on the corn-shuck mattress inside. The nail keg was on its side, empty. And there was no girl, and there was no father, and out front in the frozen mud, where anybody could see them, where they'd been set down deliberate and square in the middle of the path like a message left for whoever came looking, were her boots. Both of them, side by side, toes pointing north at the mountain. And on the step, in a basket lined with a folded scarf, 12 brown eggs, unbroken, with a bit of paper under the top one that had 4 words on it in a child's careful pencil. And I have that paper yet, and I am not going to tell you what it says until I've told you the rest. I did not read the note that night. I want to start there because it's the truest thing I know about myself. There was a piece of paper under the top egg with 4 words on it, and I saw the pencil marks in the moonlight, and I put it in my breast pocket without turning it over, and I told myself it was too dark, and it was not too dark. There was a moon like a chip of bone, and I could have read a newspaper by it. I stood in the wreck of that house for maybe 20 minutes. The frost was coming down the way it does when the sky's gone perfectly clear and mean. You can hear it, a kind of tightening, the grass going stiff by inches. The north end of the roof lay in the room like a dropped hand. Sod and rotten pine and 100 pounds of dirt, and under the edge of it a corn shuck mattress with the shucks spilling out gray, and the whole place smelled of chickens and whiskey and cold earth. 2 things I noticed, and did not let myself understand. The first was that the dirt of that fallen roof had been dug, not settled, not fallen through. Somebody had gone into it, you could see where, a trough about the length of a man, and the sod thrown back in clods on either side, and the clods had been thrown by hands, not a spade, hands. The marks were in them. The second was that there was blood froze black on the doorframe, about waist high, in the shape of a palm. And I got on my horse. I want that in the ledger too. I got on my horse and I rode 6 miles home with a basket of 12 eggs on my lap, and I did not follow the tracks that went north out of that yard, because I was 51 years old and my hip hurt, and it was a cold night, and at bottom, because I had already worked out that I was the last man on God's earth with any right to go after her. Now about the truth. I told it. 3 days later, in Halbert's store, with 8 or 9 people in there getting out of the wind, I stood up in front of them like a man about to be hanged, and I said it all. That I'd been buying setting eggs off Rose Kessler for Ynez Tallow every first Tuesday for 2 years. That she'd paid me in wild honey worth 3 times what the eggs cost, and cut it herself out of the bee trees on the north slope, and came down with her arms swollen. That she had 4 hens because 31 had died. I'd kept the count. God help me. I'd kept the count in a book. And that she'd never once stolen so much as an eggshell in her life. And that I'd known this and stood on my step and said nothing. I had it all ready. I'd been 3 nights working out the order of it. And here's what happened. Halbert wiped the counter. Somebody's boy asked for a licorice and got it. And old Deed Whitmer looked up from the stove and said, "Well, that's a shame," and looked back down. That was all. Rose Kessler wasn't there, but it got to her, and I heard from her nephew that what she said was, "Amos Deal's got a soft spot is all." Not a denial, not shame, a diagnosis. I had a soft spot, the way a man has a bad tooth, and the girl was the thing my soft spot had happened to, and the eggs had never really been the point of anything. And everyone had known that all along, and only I had been so simple as to think a fact could unmake it. Aunt Preen heard it and never mentioned it to me. Not once, not in 11 more years of him living in that town. He'd say good morning. He'd rent a rig for the 4th of July. That was my education. 51 years old, and I finally learned it. The truth is not a payment. The truth is a receipt. It proves a debt was owed. It does not settle it. And a man who thinks he can walk into a store and set down the truth and walk out clean has confused a piece of paper with a coin. I went home and I looked at the entry owed, everything. Rendered, nothing, and the pen hovered over it because I had a great desire to add a line that said told the town. Nov. 17. And I didn't. Because it would have gone in the wrong column. I'd have been writing it under what she owed me. A witness, at last, arriving 900 hours late and expecting to be thanked. The winter was the worst since '78. Nobody went up the mountain in a winter like that. Barrow didn't come down for powder or coffee that fall, and by January the town had decided he died up there, and there was a certain satisfaction in the way they said it. A man who doesn't need us has finally been corrected. I made 2 attempts. The first was in December, and I got maybe 9 miles up the cottonwood before the sorrel went into her chest in a drift, and I turned around, and I was not sorry to turn around, and I hated myself for the not being sorry. The second was in February, a fall spring, 5 days of thaw and then a hard crust you could nearly walk on. I took a mule instead of the horse because I'd finally understood why Barrow kept a mule, and I took a sack of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, a bolt of red flannel, and because I am a fool, a tin of peppermints. It took me 2 days. I found the cabin by the smoke, which is the only way anybody has ever found it. It was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, some kind of burrow, some kind of animal's arrangement. It was a good cabin. Small, dug back into the hill on the north side so it had earth on 3/4 of it, and the woodpile was stacked square, and the stack was enormous, and there were snowshoes on the wall and a beaver stretcher, and 40 or 50 poles laid up under the eaves for something, and the whole place had the look of a thing that had been done properly by somebody who had all the time in the world and nobody to hurry for. And in the dooryard in the snow, in a pen made new out of split aspen with a shake roof over half of it and a lantern hung under the roof, were 9 chickens. 9. I sat on that mule, and I counted them twice. Barrow came out with a rifle and then put it down without any embarrassment, and he looked at my sack of flour a long moment, and then he looked at me and he said, "She'll want to say if you come in." So I stood in the snow while he went inside, and I heard nothing at all for the better part of 5 minutes, and I stood there with the mule breathing and the chickens muttering, and I understood I was being deliberated over, and it was the most honest treatment I'd had in my life. Then the door opened, and she stood in it. Ynez Tallow, 16.5. She'd got some flesh on her. That was the first thing. Her face had lost the gray. She had on a man's shirt and a hide vest and boots that weren't hers, and her right hand was wrapped in a rag from the base of the thumb around the wrist, and it was wrapped fresh and clean, which meant somebody was changing it. She looked at the sack of flour. She looked at the bolt of red flannel a good while. "You brought this up on a mule," she said. "I did." "Why?" And I opened my mouth, and what came out was, "Because I've been keeping accounts wrong for 2 years, and I don't know how to fix them." Which was not what I'd rehearsed. I'd rehearsed something about the town and about Preen, and about how I'd stood up in Halbert's store, and thank God, none of it got out. She stood in the door. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee. He does something to it, I don't know what, it's terrible." I stayed 2 days on account of a blizzard, and I learned the shape of it in pieces, over a table, mostly from her, because Barrow talked about as much as a stove talks. That night in October she'd walked home 6 miles from town with 12 eggs and nothing else. No flour, no account at Halbert's, nothing to sell to anybody within 40 miles, because the word would be out by Thursday, and there wasn't a soul in that country who'd trade with an Apache girl the town had called a thief. And she got home, and her father knew. I never found out how. Somebody rode out, is my guess, one of the Dunphys being helpful. Ynez Tallow was sitting up when she came in, which she said she'd known was bad before she was through the door, because he'd only sit up for 2 reasons, and one of them was money. He wanted the hens. Not to eat. He wanted to sell them to a man in Ridgeway who'd offered him $1.50 for the 4, and more to the point, would front him a jug on the strength of it. And she said no. And he explained to her, in the reasonable way of a man who has thought about a thing for 6 hours in the dark, that the birds were on his land and under his roof and eating corn he'd bought, none of which was true and all of which he believed, and that she was going to hand them over. She said no again, and she picked up the nail keg and she started for the door with it. I asked her what she was going to do, where she thought she was going at 9 at night in October in the frost with a keg of chickens. She said she hadn't thought about it. She said, "I only knew the door was that way." He came off the mattress and got hold of the keg, and she wouldn't let go, and they turned all the way around in that little room, twice, in the dark, with the birds screaming, and Ynez Tallow, who could not stand up straight and had not been able to for a month, went backwards into the prop. There was a prop. That's the thing. That's the whole thing. She'd put it there herself in August, a length of cottonwood wedged under the ridgepole where the rot was worst, because she'd known for a year the roof was coming, and she'd propped it and told him, and he'd said he'd see to it. It went out from under, and 100 years of sod and dirt and rotten pine came down on the north end of that room, and it came down on him. Here's the part I asked her about twice, and she told me twice, and the two tellings were exactly the same, which is how you know a person isn't remembering. She's reciting. She'd made it into something she could say without being inside it. She said the keg was in her arms and the birds were quiet all at once, and she was standing in the doorway with dirt raining down, and she was outside and he was inside, and there was a beam across his chest, and he was making a sound she'd never heard a man make. And she said she stood there. She said, I want you to understand I stood there. She said she does not know for how long. She said what went through her mind was not anything about love or duty or God. She said what went through her mind was the arithmetic. 4 hens, 2 years, 31 dead, 12 eggs on the step where she'd set them down, 6 miles of frost and a town that had shut its door, and one road out of that yard going north, and she was holding everything she had ever built in a nail keg against her chest, and it weighed about 9 pounds. And she said, and this is the sentence, this is the one I have carried for 41 years. If I put down the keg to dig, the foxes get them before morning. I knew it like I know my hand. I stood in the door and I did the sum, and the sum came out that he was worth less than the birds. She set down the keg. She went in and she dug her father out of a roof with her hands. It took her, she thinks, 3 hours. She broke the small bone in her right hand somewhere in the 2nd hour and did not know it until the next day. She got him out from under and she dragged him by the shoulders into the yard because she was afraid of what was left of the roof, and she laid him in the frozen mud, and he was alive and both his legs were wrong and he was crying. And then she went and looked in the nail keg. 3 of them had got out. She found one of those, so 2 hens. She said that was when she sat down. Barrow came in the morning. He'd been 20 minutes behind her out of town, and he'd camped a half-mile off in the trees, and he had not come to the house, and when I heard that I got angry the only time, and I said, out loud at his table, you were half a mile away all night, and he looked at me and said, she never asked. And I have thought about that too, for a long time. I think he was wrong. I think a man ought to come when he hears a roof go, and there's no way he didn't hear it. But I have also come to think that Cull Barrow had spent whatever number of years he'd spent up on that mountain in the deliberate practice of never taking one single thing off another human being without being asked, including the chance to be the one who saves them, and that this is a form of respect so extreme and so cold that most people, on the receiving end of it, would call it neglect. And a few, one, maybe, in a generation, would recognize it as the first honest offer they had ever been made. He came at dawn. He put Ynez Tallow on the mule. He asked her once if she wanted to go to town or up, and she said up, and that was the entire conversation. She put her boots on the step, toes north. Because she was walking out on the last of it. Because she was never going to need to go back down that road for anything. Because a girl who has just learned what she is capable of doing the sum on is not going to keep the boots she wore to town to be called a thief in. And she set the 12 eggs down beside them with a note under the top one, for the only person in that town who'd ever known what the eggs were for. We ate beaver tail and cornbread and Barrow's terrible coffee for 2 days, and Ynez Tallow lay in the corner behind a hung hide and did not speak to me, and I did not go behind the hide. His legs had knit crooked. He would never walk again without 2 sticks, and he was, at that point, 4 months sober, not by any conversion, but because there was nothing on that mountain to drink and no way for a man with 2 ruined legs to get down it. I have known men to find God in that situation. Ynez Tallow found nothing. He lay behind that hide with his eyes open, and his daughter took him his food and set it down and went out, and neither of them said one word to the other the entire time I was in that cabin. I asked her on the second night, when Barrow had gone out to the woodpile, I asked her why she'd set up. She said because if I'd said town, they'd have taken him in. Somebody would have, Widow Kessler even. They'd have fed him and set his legs and prayed over him. She turned the coffee cup around on the table. And then he'd have told them about the roof, and they'd have believed him. Everything he said, all of it, every year, they'd have believed. She looked up. "He's mine," she said. "He's mine, and I did what I did, and nobody in that town gets to hold him." And I want to tell you I said something wise. I sat there and looked at my hands. The 9 chickens. That was Barrow. She'd come up the mountain in October with 2 hens, and Barrow had gone back down in November down the east side, 4 days, to a Mormon settlement on the Dolars where nobody knew him. And he'd come back with 7 hens and a sack of oats, and he had traded a winter's beaver for them, which is to say he had traded roughly $110 for about $4 worth of chickens, and he did it without mentioning it to her until he set them in the snow. She was furious. She told me this herself, furious 2 months later remembering it. She said, "I told him I wouldn't take them." What'd he say? He said they weren't a gift, they were a stake, and I'd pay him back out of the increase and he'd keep account. She almost smiled. I said, "With what?" He said, "With hens." I said, "And what'll you do with hens?" And he said. She stopped, and she looked at me and she said it carefully, the way you set down something breakable. He said nothing. "I'll never use them, that's how you'll know it's yours." I've turned that over more than any other thing in this account, because I had spent 2 years buying that girl eggs, and every single time, 22 times, I had handed them across a fence and said the word square. Square, Nessie. Like I was closing a door. Like I was making certain, out loud in the open air, that no debt should exist between us in either direction, because a debt is a rope, and I did not want a rope between that girl and me where the town could see it. And Barrow, who did not have the sense God gave a mule, opened the account on purpose. He made her owe him. He gave her a debt she could work off in the only currency she'd ever been able to manufacture out of nothing, and he told her he'd keep account. And then he went and built her a pen with a shake roof over half of it so the snow wouldn't sit on the birds. I bought her eggs for 2 years, and I gave her nothing. He took $110 off his own life, and he gave her a future, and the future was not the chickens. The future was the debt. It was the first thing anybody ever trusted her enough to let her owe. They came down in April, all 3 of them, and they did not stop in the town. Barrow had a wagon by then bought from a man on the Dolars. Ynez Tallow lay in the back with his sticks beside him. Ynez walked. And the chickens, 26 chickens by April, she had set every egg she could keep the 2 originals sitting on and lost 11, and told me the number without my asking, because by then she knew I kept a book. The chickens rode in crates. They went down the road on the far side of the creek, which is a longer way and a worse one, and has to be walked in 2 places. I saw them from the corral. I saw the crates and I saw her walking, and I put my hand up. She didn't see me. Or she did. I've never been able to decide, and it has never mattered because either way is the same thing. Trinidad, she sold eggs in Trinidad. That's all. There's no more drama in it than that. She was 17 years old and she sold eggs at the market to Italian miners' wives, and then she sold hens, and then she had a lot on the south end with 200 birds on it, and by 91 she was selling to the railroad. By 98 there were 3 lots and a wagon with a name painted on the side. The name was Tallow and Barrow. He had refused it, apparently, for years. He'd have nothing to do with the business, wouldn't come down out of the hills more than twice a year, and when she finally put his name on the wagon, he did not speak to her for 4 months. And then he came down and looked at it a long time and said, and I have this from her own mouth 30 years later, he said, "You spelled it right." He died in 1903, up there, alone, the way anybody could have predicted. She went up and buried him and came back down and did not close the business for the day because, she said, the eggs don't know. Ynez Tallow lived to 1912, 28 years in the back room of his daughter's house, on 2 sticks, sober by geography and then by habit, and never once, so far as I know, by choice. She fed him for 28 years. She never forgave him and she never put him out, and I do not believe she ever spoke to him about the roof. There's a lesson in that, I suppose, if you want one badly enough to go and dig it out. I never wanted one that bad. Now the note. I said I'd tell you. I read it on the third morning after that October night, in my own kitchen, with the light coming through the window, when I finally admitted to myself that I was not going to be able to go on until I had. 4 words in pencil, in a hand that had learned its letters late and formed them very carefully. Now we are square. I have kept that paper in the front of the ledger for 41 years. It's gone soft as cloth. You can still read it. Do you understand what she did to me? 12 eggs. On the step. The whole surplus of 2 years of stinging labor, the entire yield of everything she had left in the world after the roof came down, set out in the frost for the man who had stood on his step with his watch in his hand, and let a town call her a thief. She wasn't thanking me. She'd heard me say it every month for 2 years. Square Nessie. She had listened to me close that account 22 times in the open air, where anybody could hear that Amos Deal owed nothing to anybody and nobody owed anything to Amos Deal. And on the worst night of her life, with her father in the yard and her hens dead in the dirt, that girl sat down and did one last sum, and she paid me off. In eggs she could not spare, and she used my own word for it. And then she walked out of that yard and left me standing in the only condition I had ever asked to be left in, which was even. She gave me exactly what I'd wanted, exactly the way I'd asked for it, and it has been the ruin of me. Because a thing paid is a thing finished. There's no going back into a closed account. She never wrote to me. Not in 41 years, and I never wrote to her. And once in 96 I was in Trinidad on business, and I stood across the street from a wagon with her name on it for the better part of an hour, and then I went and got my train. I'm 82. The livery's a garage now. A boy named Dunphy runs it, grandson of the one who threw the mud clod, and he's a decent enough kid and knows nothing about any of this. The ledger's on the table in front of me. The last entry is dated 1884 and it says owed, everything. Rendered, nothing, and in 41 years I have not been able to add a line to it, and I've picked up the pen God knows how many times. Because what's the entry? Told the truth, too late, to 9 people who didn't care. That goes in the wrong column. Rode up a mountain with a bolt of flannel and a tin of peppermints. Wrong column. Everything I have ever done about it since has been a thing I did for me. There's only one line that would balance it, and it isn't mine to write. It's 4 words long, and it's in pencil, and it's in the front of the book. And she wrote it when she was 16 years old with a broken hand, and I have never once believed it. Last month a crate came on the train. No letter with it. Just a crate and a shipping card, and the card said Trinidad, and inside, packed in straw, was a jar of wild honey. She'd have to be 72 now. Cut it herself, is what I think. I think she went out and found a bee tree and put her hands in it at 72 years old and cut it and packed it and sent it to me and put no letter in. And I have been sitting here with it on my table for 26 days, and I have not opened it. Because I know what it is. She's opened the account. She's opened it again after 41 years. With the exact same jar she opened it with the first time, and she's waiting, and it's my turn, and now I have to go get the eggs. 6 miles, boots on, toes pointing north. I don't know that I've got it in me. I've never had it in me. But the sorrel's dead 30 years, and I've got a nephew with an automobile, and I have written him a letter this morning asking what it would cost to be driven.